So now coming on to this evening's presentation by Professor Mike Benton. Now, Mike is a professor of vertebrate paleontology at the University of Bristol and the author of Dinosaur Behaviour, an illustrated guide. His many previous books include standard reference works, textbooks, and popular books on dinosaurs and the history of life. He was elected as Fellow of the Royal Society in 2018 for his scientific research and awarded an OBE in 2021 for his work in science, outreach, and engagement. So can I ask now, Mike, if you could make a start? Oops, sorry, you're muted. That's
Yes.
it. Right.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. And I'm going to talk about dinosaur behavior, and particularly my theme will be to show you the kinds of evidence that we use. Some of the stories may be familiar, some maybe less so, but a background theme behind this whole talk is how we can do science when we're working on the past history of the Earth. And we can learn a great deal about how dinosaurs lived without the use of a time machine. So here we go. I will now share talk. Excellent. Okay, so this is the cover of the book that the president just mentioned, published by Princeton University Press. Beautiful illustrations by Bob Nichols. Some of you will be familiar with that wonderful paleo artist. And as mentioned, I'm a paleontologist by trade. I teach students, I do research, and I've published a number of books on paleontological topics. And where I want to start is by listing a variety of features of dinosaurs that we might regard as aspects of their behavior. And so you can look at this broad list, and what I'm going to do is ping back and forwards, looking at some key facts or hypotheses that have been established, and a little bit about when, and then I'm going to look in more detail at some of the stories. Unfortunately, I don't have time this evening to look at examples of each, but more or less these are like chapters in the book to some extent. So here are some topics about the biology or behavior of dinosaurs. Here are some observations under these topics. I'll just read out the red ones. So red was color and origins. So dinosaurs had feathers with patterns of colorful stripes and blobs. That's an observation about their color and patterns. And the other one is dinosaurs dominated the Earth for 165 million years, but they rose to dominance only after major changes in climate. That's a kind of evolutionary claim. And the other facts, which I won't read through, are to do with locomotion, feeding, growing up, looking after babies, why they get to be so huge, etc., etc. And when we look at the dates of when these pieces of information became clear, we can see that all of this has happened this century. And so, and I could find much more recent examples if one wished. I could limit them to the 2020s. So this introductory point then is that we have learned a great deal about dinosaur behavior and biology in the last 20, 25 years. And all of these examples I give are based upon evidence. In other words, they can be tested. And that is the criterion for being scientific. So you know, I think, that we dig up skeletons. These new finds are reported all the time in the media. And I think you know as well that if the bones within the skeleton are relatively complete, it's possible to put together the whole skeleton with a fair degree of confidence. And then, as shown in the illustration here, working from the tip of the tail to the tip of the snout, progressively add muscles, soft tissues, skin, and color. And I'm going to talk about color in a moment for those of you who don't know the story. How do we know the color? So locomotion, though, first of all, because mechanical functions might seem to be easier to comprehend. How can we measure these aspects of ancient animals like dinosaurs? And of course, when we look at certain dinosaurs, like the animal on the left, we may find a modern analog, in this case, the ostrich, and we may think we can in some way interpret the fossil in the light of this modern analog. It's not making a claim that this dinosaur is directly an ancestor of the ostrich, but that in some way, all things being equal, probably it would function in certain comparable ways. But more importantly, we can calculate stuff, we can measure stuff. And so this is a very famous example from the work of McNeill Alexander, who was a professor at Leeds in the 1970s and 80s. And he realized in 1976 and published that there is a formula from which you can calculate the running speed of an animal based upon measurements of its trackway. And some of you will know this story. It's a classic. And in fact, this is the 50th anniversary of McNeill Alexander's paper in Nature in which he presented this. And we regard this as one of the foundational papers of modern, you could call it experimental paleontology. So this happy-looking person is sitting on a rock surface representing an ancient beach, across which a number of dinosaurs are trotting. And I think you can see from the bottom, I'll try and make this into a laser pointer if I can. Yes, here we go. So you can see from the bottom towards the right, there's a three-toed footprint there, which I'm just outlining. This, I think, is the right foot, left, right, left, right, left, right, and off it goes into the background. And there is another track that starts over here on the right, top right, and heads across somehow this way. So what do we need to know to calculate speed? His formula is based on an intuition, which I think you can explain even to a 4 or 5-year-old child, which is that the faster you are moving, the wider apart your footprints. In other words, as you move faster, your stride length increases. Think of dawdling along at a very slow kind of student pace. You're barely moving, your footprints are very tiny, or the spacing, I should say, is very tiny, the stride length, compared to running for the bus, where you're loping along at several times faster, and the spacing of your footprints is proportional to the speed. So this formula, that's all it's doing. And if we work our way along it, what can we tell from the fossil? Well, of course, we assume that the value of gravity in the Jurassic is the same as it is today, 10 meters per second. We measure the stride length from the spacing of the footprints. And just to remind you, stride length is the distance from a fixed point on one of the feet from its first to its next striking the ground. So if this is the right-hand foot, this is it again, the distance from the tip of the heel to the tip of the heel. It's not the distance from right to left, it's right to right. Same foot hitting the ground. Hip height, how do we know that? The size of the footprint tells us pretty much who made that track. And size is really important because speed is not simply proportional to the spacing of the tracks. It obviously depends upon the size of the animal, because a small creature would have to make a big effort and create quite a speed to space its tracks as much as this, maybe 2 or 3 meters apart. Whereas a large animal would be moving in a fairly leisurely manner, making these spacings. So there it is. Now, why do we believe it? Do we believe it? We could say we don't believe it. But then the follow-up question is point out the error. In other words, this is a claim. McNeill Alexander was making a claim 50 years ago. I will tell you the running speed of this dinosaur or this other animal, whether living or extinct, based upon its trackway. And it, being scientific, it's a sort of challenge. You can say, I don't believe it, but then you're being like a flat earther. If you don't believe it, you have to point out the error. What part of the formula is wrong? And you can find that, of course, by doing experiments, as he did. He ran humans and horses. Some of you may have seen the Horizon program in 1976. I can remember it, where he had his long-suffering family running up and down the beach at Brancaster in Norfolk, and he was timing them with a stopwatch and then measuring their footprints. And it worked just as well for bipedal humans as for four-legged quadrupedal dogs, and he even had a horse trotting along. It works. So there we are. This is science. This is not guesswork. It may be right or wrong. We know that a scientific hypothesis is the best explanation based upon the evidence that we currently have. But every hypothesis is capable of being rejected. In this case, it can be counter-checked, and I won't go through the calculations here, but John Hutchinson, who follows in the footsteps, I could say, of McNeill Alexander, who's a professor at the Royal Veterinary College in London, he had the insight that we could also estimate speed from measurements of the musculature of the hind limbs. So I'll just give you in words the general theory. I won't give you the formula. His observation is that the faster you can run, generally the bigger your thigh muscles. So if you look at a sprinter, a human sprinter, they have massive muscles in their legs to power those legs at great speed. And in fact, the capability of running is proportional to the power of those muscles, which can be measured by their diameter, their cross-sectional area. And he asked a simple question of, if you took a chicken, which is typically regarded as a good runner, if you've ever tried to catch a chicken, they can run pretty well. So typically a chicken weighs about 0.5 kilogram. So here it is in the graph, 0.5 kilogram. If you scale it up to 5 or 6 tons, equivalent to a T-Rex, would it still have the same running ability? And I think even without calculating anything, you might think, oh, probably not. There's something about becoming so hugely heavy that it would take enormous muscles to power that vast animal at anything like the equivalent of the speed of a 0.5 kilogram chicken. And it's absolutely right. When you plot them here, here is the regular chicken at the bottom, well within the best running ability area. And as you go up to the 6-ton chicken right up here, any kind of running is impossible. It's just too heavy. Its bones would break. It could never have sufficient musculature, etc., etc. That's running, walking, trotting. It's possible then to calculate speeds and modes of locomotion for extinct organisms. What about feeding? In this case, biomechanical calculations have been made also. So Bates and Falkingham are based in, let me think, Liverpool, I think in Liverpool, and they did these calculations a number of years ago, trying to answer that childish question of, could T-Rex bite a car in half? And if you ever are asked that, you can say, yes, of course, because they were capable of generating 50,000 newtons of force with their jaws. What is 50,000 newtons? It's something like the equivalent of 5 tons. In other words, 5 tons of weight pressing down on the piece of food or the car or whatever. And that's certainly enough force to bite a car in half. And is much, much more than any living creature. Look at these measurements for great white sharks and lions and so on. And humans are hopeless. We can't even begin to enter the biting stakes. So how do we know this? This is what Bates and Falkingham did. They scanned a T-Rex skull, and they worked then with the digital skull in the computer. They were not trying to do calculations on the fossil bones. Obviously, that would be pointless, because as soon as you start experimenting with the fossil, it'll break up and just fall apart. And it would be pointless because the physical properties of the fossil are nothing like the physical properties of bone. And equally, people realize you can't do these experiments in the laboratory at all, because whatever you make your skull out of, you could make it out of wood or metal or plastic, but you're only testing the capabilities of a wooden skull or a plastic skull, not a skull made of bone. Whereas when it's in the computer, you can then give the bone, as shown here in white, whatever physical properties you like. And of course, they gave it the physical properties of bone, calculated from experiments with pieces of cow bone. And the properties, the physical properties, by which I mean material properties, these are things like how far can you bend the bone before it breaks? And how far can you compress the bone before before it breaks? So these are measurements of capability of compression and bending, stresses and strains that the bone can withstand before it gives way. So that's really important. And then they model pieces of food shown in yellow. The hinge line is shown in blue. It's just a simple hinge, flapping hinge. The jaw just opens and shuts. Nothing like the more complicated movements that mammals have got, because we can chew our food. So our jaws can kind of go up and down and rotate. And of course, other mammals like cows and horses can do that. But dinosaurs could not. They just had a very simple hinge. We know that, of course, from the bones. And then shown in red are like rubber bands representing the main lines of force of the different jaw muscles. And so they were able to estimate the forces exerted by these different jaw muscles based upon their estimated dimensions. And because the majority of these muscles are within the skull, you have to be able to pack them all in. And so you're not going to over or underestimate the dimensions of those jaw muscles, because you've got to fit them all inside the space. And so using that, they made this calculation. And of course, again, I repeat that whereas when I started as a paleontologist, professors would sit around puffing their pipes and discussing with each other, oh, I think maybe T-Rex could bite like this or like that. And the other professor would say, oh, I don't think so, maybe like this. That's pre-scientific. That's what we would call speculation. And in many cases in the earth sciences, of course, that's all we have. We don't necessarily always have the tools. But in this case, we do have the tools. So this calculation is exact. They published the methods that they used, the assumptions that they made. And since 2012, other people who are critical say, oh, come on, that's far too high. That can't be true. They then go through the calculations and they would ask questions. Have you, for example, overestimated the volume of the muscles and overestimated their potential power? Or have you made some false assumptions about the material properties of the bone or the teeth? And so this is not speculation, though. This is scientific discussion, I hope you can see. And just to make the point even more clearly, that method used, that analysis used a method called multi-body dynamic modeling, which is a very standard engineering method. Another such method is called finite element analysis, and my colleague Emily Rayfield here, professor in the University of Bristol, uses this approach, and she had a number of years ago what many would regard as the dream PhD topic, which was to calculate the biting ability of T-Rex. I think every 7-year-old would say, yes, yes, I'll do that. That sounds good. And here's what she did, like in the previous study. You take your skull of T-Rex, which, bear in mind, is a pretty large object. It's about the size of a car. You scan it. You repair the model in the computer in case the skull is actually crushed or missing some parts. You can repair left and right and make the model perfect. You model the teeth separately from the bone. You notice that it's divided up into pyramid shapes. These are the so-called elements. And you can divide the 3D structure into as many of these elements as you like. The more you have, the longer the calculations take, but you can't have too few because you might then be simplifying it too much. And then next, you apply those material properties, which of course are different for the bones and the teeth. The teeth are harder, they're more brittle than the bone, and then the bone has varying properties in different parts of the skull, depending on how compact it is, whether it has got open spaces inside that may be filled with soft tissues. You then apply forces, and in the case of FEA, it highlights dangerously high stresses in red and very relaxed and comfortable stresses in blue and green. So you can see in this upper figure, whatever the force is, this is some force on the snout, it's generating some very uncomfortable high stresses. Whereas in this case, a pressure from below in biting is okay. There's a yellow patch at the back of the jaw. It's not too bad. Why do we believe it? Because we risk our lives on FEA. Many of you, most of you have voted with your lives. You didn't know it. When you climbed on an aeroplane, you are effectively signing a document saying, I believe FEA works, because your aircraft was designed using FEA. They don't build an aircraft out of plastic and aluminium and then fly it and say, well, let's hope it stays up. You do all of those calculations in the computer before you build the thing and risk somebody's life. And likewise, skyscrapers and modern bridges and everything, they're all tested to destruction using this method. So we believe it, it works. What about ecology? What about food webs? I think this is something that may be a little bit more familiar to traditional paleontologists. We know that we can reconstruct a scene like this with a variety of animals and plants, and often in finer detail, you could zoom in and you could show some insects and some mollusks and some other creatures that might be living there, and you can identify all of the different plant groups and compare them with living forms. So I think everybody's familiar with that idea that if you collect a lot of fossils from a single, very rich locality, you can get a pretty complete picture of the ecosystem, barring a few organisms like earthworms or jellyfish, of course, that may not leave fossils. But in those cases, we try to look at places where there is exceptional preservation. So it's even possible to get soft-bodied organisms too. And then I think, again, a very undergraduate kind of thing to do is to take the scene with the different animals and plants and look at each one and reconstruct using a variety of evidence. Well, what do we think this one was eating? And I think in these cases, we can say, for example, T-Rex, we know for a fact, would eat Triceratops because bones of Triceratops have been found in the coprolites of T-Rex. So we have absolute evidence that this was one thing that T-Rex would eat. And very probably, like all predators, it would eat whatever it could get. So the likelihood is T-Rex would be eating all the large dinosaurs. And then there are smaller predators like this little raptor here. What would it be eating? Well, it probably couldn't tackle these bigger dinosaurs. It might be eating the mammals and some other smaller creatures, lizards and things like that. And then the herbivory lines shown in green, coming from all the different plants and who eats them. And again, in some cases, there is coprolite evidence or bite evidence on the plant leaves to show us who's eating it. But in other cases, over here, for example, we have flowering plants, we have mammals, we have insects. If you find a fossil dragonfly like this, it's most likely that it's going to be eating the same kind of food as a modern dragonfly. And it's not a herbivore, this is just insects in general. So there are herbivorous insects, of course, which in turn the dragonfly would be preying upon. So as for ecology, we can begin to reconstruct some of the information, and then we can take it further. So this is a more complete network of a similar fauna from the late Cretaceous, showing T-Rex is somewhere over here, all the dinosaurs, but also we've got lots more lizards and birds and insects and fish and all sorts of other creatures with all the arrows connecting who eats whom. And then having that information, I don't have another slide, but having that information of the network, it's possible, and people have done this in recent papers, to calculate the stability of the ecosystem. When you have a complete diagram like the one at the bottom, you can then do experiments by knocking out species. And what people find is when we come up towards a mass extinction event, and particularly in the immediate aftermath, ecosystems may be quite unstable, meaning you've already lost a lot of biodiversity. Things are evolving in a somewhat chaotic manner to try to reclaim the ecospace that has been vacated, and yet it's still overall quite unstable. Species are coming and going quite fast. And so we can now take this kind of observational data, which is fairly easy to understand and collect, and take it further into asking questions about the stability of ecosystems using software, using computational software that modern ecologists use. So they have developed software to look at stability of natural ecosystems for purposes of conservation. We often have a question like, if human beings modify natural ecosystems, what are going to be the consequences? If we remove red squirrels, if we remove badgers or whatever, what will be the longer term or the wider scale effect? And we can use the same software that we know works on the modern faunas. We can use it on these ancient faunas and make similar kinds of observations. One of the boxes with huge size, I'm not going to go into this in an enormously detailed kind of way, but this diagram, some of you may have seen it. It's from a German paleontologist called Martin Sander. And about 10 years ago, he had a very large grant from the German funding authorities to look into the question of how did the sauropods like this Brachiosaurus get to be so huge? And he looked at every aspect of their biology. What are they eating? How fast do they grow? In other words, how long does it take for them to get to being adults? How many eggs do they lay? You know, you can find this out by looking at fossilized nests. And so there's all kinds of information, very high body mass at the top, predation pressure from theropods, the predatory dinosaurs, points about the plants that they're eating. He had paleobotanists and modern experts on modern plant nutrition looking at the kinds of plants that the sauropods would be eating. So things like cycads and conifers and lycopods. What's the nutritional value? In other words, if they're eating ferns, how many ferns or how much, what volume, what mass would they need to eat every day just to survive? I'll summarize the two key facts. Sauropods were able to be enormously huge, much bigger than any living land animal today. Just to remind you, the biggest sauropods weighed 50 tons, whereas a typical elephant weighs 5 tons. So these dinosaurs were 10 times the mass of any modern living terrestrial animal. And they didn't do it because they couldn't do it simply because gravity was less. Gravity, as far as we know, was not less. You can't just make stuff up like that. That's like bringing in fairies and saying, oh, they were held up by imps and goblins that helped them to walk. Well, that's nonsense. And to say gravity was less is equally nonsense. To say, as people have, oh, they lived in water, they waded around like wandering about in a swimming pool, is equal nonsense. They did not. There's plenty of, they would occasionally go in a pond, of course, but they didn't stand there all day. Their secret was they would eat as much in a day as a modern elephant weighing 1/10 of the mass. So a 50-ton sauropod ate about the same amount of plant food as a 5-ton elephant. And the reason that Sander was able to calculate that was that elephants, like humans, devote 90% of their food intake to maintaining their endothermy. So of the food you eat every day, 90%, 9/10, is devoted to running your inner furnace, is devoted to those physiological processes that keep your body temperature steady on hot days, cold days, etc., etc. As far as we know, sauropods did not do that. They were living in an equable world where climates were quite gentle. There were no polar ice caps. So the differential in temperature from the equator to the poles was a lot less then than it is today. So they saved an enormous amount of energy. Or you could turn that around and say, well, they could get to be 10 times bigger than elephants because they didn't need to eat a huge amount more food. And then the second way they saved energy was they didn't care for their young. They dumped their eggs and buggered off, which is, for those of you who brought up children, you know what I mean. The energy we have to devote to bringing up children, and particularly if you know anything about elephants, the mother can only give birth to one child at a time. They have to carry that benighted baby for something like 18 months, giving birth to a baby that probably already weighs half a ton is an enormously risky business. And the baby has to be huge. They can't give birth to a tiny baby because the baby, of course, like a baby horse, has got to be able to jump up and walk within half a day. and it's got to be able to keep up with the herd. So the whole process of reproduction for elephants is enormously energetic, energy wasting. So that's how they did it. And there's a tip. Don't waste energy on running your inner furnace. Don't waste energy on your kids. What about color? I've promised you color. And some of you will know the story, some of you not. But I think this is what I was involved in this. This was a discovery we made. This is a real discovery. And whereas in the old days to say, here I am, I'm a professor, I'm telling you dinosaurs were purple with yellow spots, that's not a discovery. That's just an opinion. And it's not scientific because it can never be rejected. There's no way you can prove that dinosaurs were not purple with yellow spots. They may well have been, or some may well have been. But what we're showing here, and these paintings by Bob Nichols show the true covering of the dinosaur, this mix of scales. In this case, this is Colinda dromeus. This is an amazing herbivore from Russia. This mix of scales and feathers, we know this because the fossils are exceptionally well preserved, and we know the colors. And so this painting, this wonderful painting by Bob Nichols, is one of several that he has done, where we would say, unlike paintings up to a few years ago, this one is defensible. We can go around every part. Here's the face, and here's the feathers on the head, the shoulders. Look at these spots here. Look at the scales on the forearms and the scales on the shins. Look at the type of scales on the tail. Look at the speckled pattern on the thigh. All of this is evidence-based. So it starts in 2010. Here's our paper. And I want you to notice the word melanosome. This is the key. And so our claim is not like a Sun headline. We know the color of dinosaurs. But nonetheless, it's a pretty explicit statement. And there was a lot of debate and argy-bargy, and it went through 4 stages of review before it was finally accepted. But it stood the test of time. So we were presenting for the first time in this paper ever a hypothesis based on evidence for the color and the patterns across a whole dinosaur. And of course, this gave rise to a great deal of excitement, great deal of press reporting. And it so happened another team at Yale University in the States were onto it at the same time, looking at a different dinosaur. And so the 2 papers came out fairly close together. And we were looking at this one here with the nice gingery stripy tail. They were looking at this one here with black and white stripes and a nice gingery crest on the head. And in both cases, these are hypotheses based upon evidence, and they have stood the test of time. People have tried to reject or refute the hypothesis. So far, so good. Tomorrow, we may fall, but that's the nature of science. Whereas speculation, nobody can ever criticize you, but nobody can reject. So being a scientist, as we were trying to be, is full of risk. But at least it's more satisfying because you've got evidence. So we were making a very clear statement that we could now, as of that date in 2010, we could now look at certain dinosaurs where the preservation was appropriate. And we could, for example, say this particular reconstruction is incorrect, whereas this one here is correct because it shows what the fossils show. Of course, this is a lovely story because it relies on exceptional fossils. And one of the joys of our field is the amazing beauty of fossils and rocks and geological phenomena. And we must never forget that. These fossils in the illustration remind us that the quality of the fossils we are dealing with often is quite extraordinary. And we're living in times where we can get more and more information from these astonishing fossils than we could have done 20 years ago with different kinds of X-ray scanning, chemical analysis, and other methods. We can make them work for us. And I remember people were, when we were going to China, people were joking, oh, someday they'll find this, someday they'll find that. And I remember people saying, nobody's ever going to find a dinosaur in amber. Well, oh yeah, here's a dinosaur in amber. It's a small one, admittedly. The piece of amber is about the size of the palm of your hand, And on the left is the tail of a dinosaur covered in feathers. The scale is easy in amber because the ants, there are always ants in amber, they're about 1 centimeter long. And so it's a small dinosaur. It was presumably climbing the tree when it was swamped by the seeping resin that turned into amber. And looking in detail at these weird feathers, you can see they are feathers because they are branching. They're not hairs. And yet they're very long and hair-like. There is no bird that has anything like this. So how do we know the color? Here it is. This is what we call the neontological toolkit. I should write the word down on the slide, but we've written a paper very recently and we call this the neontological toolkit. So to remind you, often geologists talk about neontological evidence. That's the opposition to paleontological. Paleontological is ancient life, neontological is modern life. So it's somehow a kind of uniformitarianism. We are using a toolkit, a set of observations and conclusions that we can apply to ancient life. And the first example I showed you of McNeill Alexander's formula, that is a neontological toolkit because you have the observations based on the living forms, you then apply it to your fossil and you make an inference. And if you don't like that inference, you then have to look very closely at the neontological toolkit. Is it really correct? And the good thing about neontological toolkits is you can go out and test them on the modern world. So here it is. We took feathers from a zebrafinch. We wanted to look at feathers from different parts of the body because all of these colors that we can see, from blonde through to black and brown and ginger, they are all due to one or other of two kinds of melanin. So I think most people know that melanin is a pigment. And we're mostly familiar with the common kind of melanin, which is properly called eumelanin, EU meaning true. And that is the kind of melanin that gives black, brown, and gray colors in feathers and hair and in the skin. So if you have dark colored skin, you have a lot of eumelanin. If you get freckles or a suntan in summer, that is eumelanin building up in the skin. And pheomelanin is the other kind of melanin that is commonly found in birds and mammals, which gives a ginger color. So in humans, that is expressed by people who have ginger hair. So if you ever thought, I've got ginger hair, I must be special, you are quite right, because you have that special kind of melanin which contains some sulfur, whereas eumelanin contains some copper. And the sulfur color tends to give a reddish tinge, and the copper a darker black, brown, gray kind of tinge. And they map onto differently shaped melanosomes, because when the melanin goes into the feather or the hair, both of which are made of the protein keratin, which is the same as your fingernails, so the natural color of keratin is transparent, like with your fingernail. And the color of your fingernail, of course, is the color of your skin underneath. And as you get older, the keratin, the melanin in your hair disappears, and you see the natural transparent color or white color of the hair. So, in the case of eumelanin, the color, the shape of the melanosome is like a sausage. Pheomelanin, it's a sphere or a ball. So we can look here, and in the ginger patch, it's full of these spherical melanosomes corresponding to pheomelanin. In the brown, black, and gray areas, it's sausage shapes. And the varying colors for eumelanin depend on the packing. So black is where there is dense packing, lots and lots of melanosomes, lots of melanin. The blonde color is where there's a very reduced amount. Let's look at the fossil. Here is our sequence of observations. Here's the fossil of Sinosauropteryx. We took samples of the feathers with a scalpel from different parts, and we looked at them under the scanning electron microscope, and we noticed that the overall structure shows us the trace of the keratin with spherical hollows where the melanosomes would have been. Here's a stray melanosome, this little spherical, slightly squished one here. They're all spherical, and we couldn't find anywhere a sausage-shaped one in Sinosauropteryx. Along the tail, you'll notice that the feathers occur in tufts, And so we looked in the spaces between the tufts and within the tufts, and we found that the feathers within the spaces are transparent, no melanin. Whereas in the darker bands where they look as if there are tufts, they were spherical, they are ginger. So here is the neontological toolkit. Here is our chain of observation. We look at the fossil, we look at the structure, we apply the neontological toolkit, we make our inference of color. So if people don't like it, and many people did not, there was a great deal of argument when these papers were published, quite rightly. It was a novel idea, that it deserves to be tested hard. But we kept going back to them and saying, if you believe we've made a mistake, please repeat the analysis. This is a standard in science. We repeat experiments. So the repeat, of course, is you look at a different specimen of Sinosauropteryx in case there was something weird about this particular one. You perhaps look at your samples under a different scanning electron microscope in case there was something weird about our microscope in Bristol that was kind of giving you a false pattern. And also, of course, the critic should look very hard at the neontological toolkit. Is this correct? Is this always the case that we have a color to shape correspondence? The fact is we do. Nobody yet has found an exception, but they may well. So there we are, that's color. What about social life? I'll scamper through these in about 5 minutes and then cease. This is to remind you of one of the advantages of CT scanning. It not only produces a very nice three-dimensional model of a skull that can then be manipulated in the computer, like I showed a moment ago, to do calculations of forces. It also allows you to look at hidden structures, in this case, the brain. And so this scan of, I can't remember which dinosaur this is, maybe Allosaurus, Ceratosaurus, one of the big predators of the Jurassic, I think. Notice the brain is this little tiny purple structure up in top of the head. Here it is in more detail. And what we're actually looking at is all the regions of the brain. And in the reptilian brain, the front part is the olfactory lobe. So this blob is the part of the brain devoted to the sense of smell. And then this blob here is the optic lobe devoted to the sense of vision. So you're maybe beginning to get the idea, you can look at these parts of the brain. And in a very general way, at least, you can say, okay, this animal probably had quite good senses of smell and vision. The semicircular canals are fantastic, this pinkish structure. It's always well preserved because they're entirely within the bone. And you may know of the semicircular canals that we have, of course. They give you your sense of balance. There's a horizontal semicircular canal. There's a couple of vertical ones. And the horizontal canal tells you the position of the head as the animal stood in a natural posture. And we were able to use these observations in the case of a dinosaur here that the juveniles are quadrupedal and the adults are bipedal. And looking at the juvenile to adult skull, you could see that the semicircular canals were kind of rotating so that the quadrupedal baby holds its head kind of pointing downwards. And then in the juvenile and the adult, it stands more upright and the head tips up. So we can learn a lot about the senses. And when you're looking at something like vision, you can look at the size of the eye socket, which is this one here actually. And you can estimate the size of the eyeball. And that allows you to calculate certain properties of vision based upon an assumption that they have a lens and that the eyeball works like a Brownie camera, that it reverses the image and you can calculate the sort of distances at which the dinosaur could focus and see things well. Even sounds, I don't imagine this will work, but people have, you may know, reconstructed the nasal passageways in the hadrosaurs and certain other dinosaurs, and then tooted through them to see what they sound like. This is almost certainly not going to work. No, I don't think it is. But anyway, the website is there, and so you can click on that. Oh. You got that, I hope. So that's supposed to be the sound of the late Cretaceous. That's a hadrosaur honking. And the males and the females notice the sexual dimorphism, and the babies have differently shaped crests. These crests house the nasal canals, and they'll be all honking and tooting at each other at different levels, possibly. Sexual dimorphism, yes, in dinosaurs and in early birds. This is a lovely example from an early bird called Confucius ornis, where the assumed male has got these long display feathers, the female does not. And so we now know that not only were the early birds in the Cretaceous hopping about and showing off like lyre birds today, so too were the dinosaurs. I should have said that the interpretation of Mr. Stripy Tail and the other one with stripy wings and so on is that this is all about display. I should have said those colors are almost certainly not camouflage, and their sharpness and clarity and the fact that they're on the tail and on the wings, even though these are dinosaurs, you think, in modern birds, that's where you see the color patterns, because these are structures that the males can kind of wave around. And so even the dinosaurs are doing that. At the bottom, to remind me, there are cases where we have abundant examples of adults and babies of the same dinosaur. This is Psittacosaurus from China with this weird kind of feathery structure on its back. And so it's possible to know something about the life table, the babies and how rapidly they grew. Is there parental care? How did they care for the young, etc., etc.? How can we do the growing up thing? Well, it's done with bone rings. So the bone of the dinosaur shows growth rings similar to a tree. And as the animal gets bigger, it's laying down rings of bone on the outside periphery. But at a certain point, the outward growth stops, it slows down. And you get the formation of a very distinctive adult kind of end of growth structure around the outside. So by measuring bones, here's a sequence of T-Rex from 4-year-old, 10-year-old, 21. There are specimens of different ages in the museums. And it's possible then either to cut the bones or to X-ray scan them, count the bone rings. And you do that for dinosaurs where the skeleton is reasonably complete, where you can actually estimate the body mass based upon the overall size and comparisons with modern animals. And so then you can plot this kind of growth curve shown here, age in years. So on the x-axis, it goes from 0 to 30 years old, and body mass from 0 to 6,000 kilograms, that's 6 tons. So here's the adult T-Rex over here, what age? 25 or 30. And so this growth curve, and this is for different genera. You can see Tyrannosaurus is the biggest, and these are somewhat smaller at adult size. These are maybe 1 to 2 tons. This is 6 tons. We've even got that growth curve. And this shows us that T-Rex, during its growth spurt from 15 to 20, was adding nearly a ton of weight each year as it was in a growth spurt, an amazing rate of growth. So what next? We can all see dinosaurs. You've all seen them in the museums. Many of you will know paleontologists. You'll have heard many of these stories that I've been telling before. And we know in the future that there are going to be many more discoveries. Many more of them will be put on show for people to see. And of course, one of my jobs, and that of all of us, I'm sure, is to engage young people, get them interested in the earth sciences in general, and keep people working in the field, and who knows what might be discovered in the future. So this is one of several books I've done. This one then goes through the different topics I've been talking about and gives you much more detail. And although it's very colorful and accessible, even to an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, it's got all the scientific evidence. It's citing the papers. It's telling you exactly how we know each thing. And I really tried hard to push out speculation and only to cover topics for which we have chains of evidence and neontological toolkits. So thank you so much for your attention, and I will stop sharing at that point and be very happy to try to answer some questions.
Yes, thanks for the talk, Mike. If you've got any questions, you can drop them in the Q&A section portion or the chat, or you could also request to talk, but just to be clear, the talk is being live streamed, so just keep that in mind if you want to request to talk. We don't have any questions yet, but did you have a question, Colin?
Just an observation, really. It's amazing how, well, if you were to try and give this talk 15 years ago, how much of it could you have actually provided any scientific evidence for? It's
I should say as a covering comment as well, I focused on dinosaurs. I don't mean to be exclusive. You could give a similarly supported talk about trilobites or fossil plants or any topic you care to. The general point being to remind ourselves that we have access to a great deal of wonderful data, and it's true of all areas of earth science. We tend to call it uniformitarianism, which is the application of observations from the modern world to the past. But I've been told repeatedly by philosophers of science, don't use the word uniformitarianism because it means nothing. It just means actualism, which is the basis of all science. It just means common sense. And so hence we invented the term neontological toolkit to really clarify. And uniformitarianism is an assumption. If you don't apply that, you're an idiot. And therefore, to even have to make a case is redundant, the philosophers tell us.
With regards to the colours you were talking about, if it's for display, quite often it would suggest a seasonality to this. It's not something that they would be displaying 12 months a year.
That's very interesting. So color, color in animals is for a variety of purposes. It can be for camouflage, and that can include distraction coloration, like the stripes on a zebra or a tiger, but that covers the whole body. So something with just a stripy tail, that's clearly not camouflage, or it's just camouflaging its tail. Color can also be for controlling temperatures, so reflecting or absorbing sunlight color temperatures, or in this case, display. But whether it would be seasonal is really interesting. We think maybe Confucius ornus with those long tail feathers, they are shed because people at first thought the males are the bigger ones. They've got those long tails. Then people have found thousands of specimens, so there's an amazing collection. And some of the biggest ones do not have tail feathers. And then somebody said, aha, maybe you're collecting them out of season. And that they are indeed big, they are indeed males, but they don't have those display feathers because at a certain time of the year, they don't need them. Some questions.
I have a couple of questions that have come in from Matthew Coyne. A great talk. Thank you very much. What is the one thing about behavior you would like to know the most? And also, what is your favorite dinosaur?
I think I'd like to know most the family structures and childcare, because if you read around, there is some evidence for care of the young. There's also plenty of evidence for no care of the young. Looking at their living relatives, birds and crocodiles, there is a certain amount of care of the young even among crocodiles. So minimally, they may have done something to protect the babies. Favorite dinosaur, I guess Sinosauropteryx, for two reasons. It was the one in which we discovered color for the first time. Also, it was the first of the feathered dinosaurs from China ever to be published. So that was the beginning of that great revolution in 1996 when we suddenly found, oh my word, maybe all dinosaurs had feathers. And that was a huge change in opinion.
So also from Rory Allen, is it now definitely established that large dinosaurs were warm-blooded? Might they have survived as cold-blooded given the warmth of the Cretaceous climate?
Yes. So I think people sometimes recall the thermoregulation of dinosaurs. They may use the term mesothermy, meaning it's somewhere between the ectothermy of modern lizards and crocs and the endothermy of modern birds and mammals. Another term people have used is gigantothermy. The meaning of that is fairly obvious, or inertial homeothermy, both of which mean, I think, about the same. Meaning that if you are very large, living in a generally equable climate, where you may have freezing nights, but the days will be pretty warm, a bit like they are today, this time of year. You are so big that on the whole, you do not cool down to the same low level of temperature as the air temperature. And there's a kind of dulling effect. So the changing air temperatures are quite dramatic, but if you're big enough, you can survive through that. And the little ones, the small predatory dinosaurs, they may have had the same kind of endothermy, high power, high energy lifestyle of modern birds. So very different between the small and the large dinosaurs, I think.
We've had a request to talk from Oliver Summerscale, so I'll just pull him.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent, wonderful. Well, thank you, Mike. That was incredibly interesting. I studied paleontology at the University of Portsmouth, and in retrospect, I wish most of my lectures were near half as interesting as that talk just was. Thank you. But I just requested to chat because my question might seem a bit wordy. But I was wondering with regards to sort of dinosaur parenting instincts, particularly with, say, theropods, is there perhaps maybe a sort of linear progression of dinosaurs throughout the Mesozoic? Say, would theropods from the early Triassic period have similar parental instincts to theropods from the late Cretaceous period, or is it more of a sort of, well, bumpy progression with lots of differences?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think we've not got far enough yet to begin to contemplate that. But it highlights a very important point, which is, I've done it in this lecture, is commonly done. We just talk about dinosaurs as a single entity, as if we can show that T-Rex does it, then they all do it. And I think you're right to highlight in the previous question about thermoregulation reminds us that actually dinosaurs were a huge and diverse group. If anything, well, as much as or more so than mammals or birds today. And when you think of the range of body sizes, and you're right, the time scale, because they were dominant ecologically speaking on land for 160, 170 million years. It's a very long time. And there's no reason to assume that they kind of stood still in evolutionary terms. They might very well have been changing dramatically. We know in some areas, of course, when you track through the theropods on the line towards birds, you can see birdie characteristics coming in 50 million years before Archaeopteryx. So the hollow bones, the reduction in size, this expansion of the forelimbs and the conversion and the acquisition of feathers. We know, of course, they had a diversity of feather types from a very early point, long before the Archaeopteryx. So yes, in terms of behavior, there you are. That's an example of the kind of sophistication that we maybe can't reach yet. But give it another generation, and maybe we will be talking about that not only can we detect evolving modes of locomotion, changing body size, sort of evolutionary trends in function, and also maybe in behavior. Yes, who knows? Maybe the later ones had more complex behavior in certain ways. We don't know. But it's important to remember not to make them too human, because we think human characteristics are good characteristics, but we must remember ecology 101 is that many organisms are highly successful by being R-selected. Mammals are highly successful by being K-selected, meaning, of course, mammals devote care to bringing up a small number of young. R-selected forms, probably including a lot of dinosaurs, just produce an awful lot of babies and bugger off and leave them to it. And it's just a successful strategy. It conserves energy, and because you may give birth to dozens of babies, only one of them needs to survive. It doesn't matter if you have a high death rate in evolutionary terms.
Great. We have another question from Stuart Hartwell. Some modern day birds are monogamous. Do you know if any dinosaurs were?
Wow. The answer is no. Not to say they were not monogamous, but we just don't know. And I think that would be a really tough one to test. We know this is true, of course, of seabirds. If you are blighted as I am with seagulls nesting on the roof of my house, and they stupidly imagine it's some sort of a cliff, and I go up on the roof and wave my squash racket at them to say, get off, this is not a cliff. They are long-lived. They live for 30 years. They are pair bonded for life. So I get the same blasted seagulls coming back to make their nests every year. So lovely to know. But I don't know how on earth you could really ever test that in a fossil case. It'd be rather difficult.
I think that's it for questions. Yeah, there doesn't seem to be any more in the Q&A or the webinar chat. So
one from JK, I don't know if that was, is that John Knight? But there was one about, are there any aspects of paleo behavior that you think will simply never be able to understood due to
limited fossil record.
Oh, apologies.
Yes, good point. Yes, so I think that question about monogamy is one of probably, we could think of many dozens of examples of aspects of behavior where the detail just isn't revealed to us. And the clues that we may have are quite tricky. So if I could suggest, some clues are like tracks or coprolites with identifiable contents. They're giving you some quite direct information about aspects of behavior, but a lot of the other stuff about how do they communicate, what sort of range of sounds would they make, or how do they handle their kids and so on. We can, on occasion, try to use something I didn't mention, but some of you are aware of. It's a bit of a fancy term for a very simple idea, the extant phylogenetic bracket. And the extant phylogenetic bracket is the idea that if you have some fossil creatures like dinosaurs, and I'm making a sort of evolutionary tree here, they are bracketed by crocodiles on the one hand and birds on the other. Therefore, if you can find that both birds and crocodiles today share a feature of any kind, could be anatomical, physiological, behavioral, you can then more or less project it down to the origin, to their common ancestor, which in this case includes the dinosaurs. So this EPB idea allows us actually to say, for example, when we're trying to understand the sensory systems of T-Rex, well, we know what the eyeball of T-Rex was like. And people would say, how do you know that? There aren't any fossils. And of course, there are not. But the fact that the eyeball of a crocodile and of a bird are the same allows us, without too much risk, to say, well, okay, all the way to that common ancestor between crocodiles and birds, somewhere at the beginning of the Triassic, they shared the same eyeball structure. All the vision features, the muscles, the way it operates, the optic nerve, blah, blah, blah. And so, that extant phylogenetic bracket can be applied to behavior. But you can see the difficulty when you think about the sounds and the parental behavior of birds. Then you realize it's quite variable, different birds. We tend to think of songbirds. They sing a beautiful song, the blackbird in the tree. They look after their babies, they do this, they do that, but then not all birds do. Other birds don't have beautiful songs, and many of them don't look after their babies very well. And then switching to crocodiles, of course, they share nothing of the bird song, so immediately it gets difficult to find behavioral features that may be shared. But it's worth remembering, we do have access to the modern relatives.
We've got one more question that's just come in. Great talk, Michael. I've been curious about Triassic dinosaur fauna in Europe and especially Greenland. Do you think we will have the opportunity to explore more in that region of the world and learn more about the distribution of dinosaurs in the Northern Hemisphere?
Oh. Well, Greenland, how interesting. Yes. There are dinosaur faunas from the late Triassic in Greenland. I think they show most affinity to Europe, as it happens. You can interpret this in a political sense if you wish, but you shouldn't, because obviously the position of Greenland and the fact that the North Atlantic had not yet really begun to open are important factors. But nonetheless, I think the terrestrial late Triassic in Greenland produces dinosaurs like Plateosaurus, as found in Germany, and I think some of the other fossils are connected with Germany. So yes, I've never been to Greenland. I think it would be a fantastic place to work. I think the subject, geology, paleontology, we've been very fortunate that over the years, probably thanks, if you drink Carlsberg beer, thank you. You are financing that research because a lot of that work is done funded through the Carlsberg Foundation. They provide a lot of funding for fieldwork in Greenland, as it happens. Maybe the geologists who go there get a crate of beer to take with them. I don't know. But yes, there's lots more to be done. I think there's lots more collecting and fieldwork to be done.
Wonderful. I think that is actually it now. I think that's all the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. It's been a
Colin, a great pleasure.
fascinating talk. It's obviously a topic that people find extremely interesting, and if you want to know more, as I mentioned, we have this meeting on the 11th of April at the Cap House Colliery, the National Coal Mine Museum of England, where there'll be further talks on this topic. And then also our next webinar on the 20th of May with Professor Phil Manning. Hopefully, will be another dinosaur-related topic. So thank you for your time this evening, Mike, and excellent talk. And thank you everyone who's attended this evening.
Pleasure. Thank you all. Thanks so much for coming.